Hello, everybody. We're going to do what I am probably going to consider some of the most interesting slash awkward lectures that we've done in this class, and that's because we are at a distance. So I'm going to cover a little bit of World War II and the Cold War for you guys. Um, just bear with me. Obviously, you can pause this at any time and you can take a look at the actual slides themselves if you want to stop and watch any of the videos and have that open as well. Just depends. Here's how I'm going to organize this for you. We're going to talk about the causes, the course, and the consequences of World War II, similar to how we did that in World War I. And then we'll take a look at the beginnings of the Cold War, because that is definitely a consequence of the Second World War. So we need to know the immediate causes of World War II. How did this become a global war? How did we bring in the entire globe into this conflict because of, well, basically a lot of aggressive nations? So we're going to need to know a little quick timeline. On that timeline would be the non-aggression pact between Germany and USSR. This is one of my favorite little political cartoons from this era because I just think, it's adorable. Look at Hitler and Stalin getting along so well. And of course, wonder how long the honeymoon will last. Look at their cake, guys. So we do need to know kind of who are the major combatants. Like, we've got two different alliances going on. We've got the Axis powers and we've got the Allies here. The Axis powers, Italy, Germany, Japan mostly, the Allies, United States, Great Britain, France, and then of course we've got the Soviet Union, the USSR over on the side there because it's complicated. It's a little complicated. Okay, so we're going to start talking about the causes of World War II. We have a lot of, long-term causes, residual causes from things that we've discussed over the past couple of weeks. The resentment from the Treaty of Versailles, of course, that's something we have discussed nonstop, basically when it comes to Germany's treatment after World War I, the Great Depression, economic failures that led to the rise of fascist leaders. Appeasement is something that is a huge factor in this. We've got mostly Great Britain and France trying to appease Hitler because they don't want to start another world war. So Hitler is going to start taking some territory throughout Europe, and as they do, you've got basically UK and France kind of wagging their finger at them like, okay, but don't take any more. It is a completely ineffective policy. Here's a political cartoon that goes along with appeasement. I quite like this one because you will notice down there at the bottom, especially if you're familiar with this artistic style, this is propaganda, wartime art that was drawn by Dr. Seuss. So there we have in the middle, we've got Neville Chamberlain, the Prime Minister of the UK, just handing out lollipops, telling everybody to go home. But of course, you're going to be, basically encouraging that behavior because nothing's being done about it. Japan. So here's how we're basically turning this into a global war. Japan is an extremely aggressive nation at this time. They have industrialized very well, as we've discussed, and they are starting to build their empire. They did this by invading Manchuria and northern China in 1931. They are not very nice occupants of China. They are killing many Chinese people. But what they're really after are resources to continue their industrialization process, coal mines, factories, and they're going to continue their descent kind of down south into China as they start going through taking more and more resources. So in 1937, we have probably one of the most terrible invasions of, modern world history. This is called the Rape of Nanking. Sometimes you'll see it Nanjing. And we've got about 300,000 people that were killed during this invasion. Of course, those numbers are kind of all over the place, but that's like the generally most agreed upon number. We've got 300,000. That is quite a lot. It was horrible. Crimes against humanity, absolutely. And just an atrocity that the Japanese are going to have to answer for later. The United States sees this aggressive behavior by Japan, and they do something that's called an embargo. So they're basically blocking Japan from trading for oil with other countries, especially oil-rich countries like the United States. And so the Japanese, they are going to retaliate by bombing Pearl Harbor. This is in Hawaii. And they are now officially bringing in the United States into the war, which is a really huge deal. They're a big superpower at this point, and they're coming into their own. The course of World War II, how does that go? Well, we can divide it into what we call two theaters. So two kind of areas of the war that we're getting kind of attention on. The first one is the European theater. That started with mostly German and Italian aggression. The policy of appeasement did not work. Hitler is just basically given the green light to do whatever he wanted. And of course, he has been building up quite a large army in order to achieve that. The non-aggression pact between Germany and USSR, it ends, okay? Just to let you know, we got that little cartoon off there on the side. Hitler is going to stab Stalin in the back. The first event that a lot of people see as being the true kind of start of the European theater is when Germany invades Poland in 1939. They had been wanting Poland. It's kind of like that place that separated the two little chunks of Germany with the Treaty of Versailles, and they did not like that. In 1941, a couple years into the war, they invade Russia. And Russia is going to switch sides to the Allies. By the way, if you ever see somebody trying to talk about the official start of the Pacific Theater, which we'll talk about in a minute, we have a lot of people pointing to the Japanese aggression being maybe one of the earlier dates, like 1937, rape of Nanking. Is that really the actual first event of World War II? It depends on which theater you're talking about. So here's a map of what's been going on in World War II's European theater. We have, of course, the aggressive nations that have taken over certain areas, and then they are starting to occupy lots of Europe. Okay, they occupy France, they occupy Poland. Remember, they kind of separated these two little corridors here. One of the reasons why they wanted to invade Poland. And they told the Soviet Union that if they kind of stuck together at the beginning, they could both invade Poland and take, half for each other. But of course, Hitler wanted the whole thing. And throughout the war, Hitler is going to push further and further into the Soviet Union. So we've got a lot of that. And don't forget that as far as European theater, we're kind of talking more about like the Mediterranean theater. There's a lot of activity going on in Northern Africa. Major turning points in the European theater. We've got the Operation Torch in 1942. We were expanding into North Africa. The real turning point, especially on the kind of western front of this here, we've got D-Day. This is the June 1944 Allied invasion of Normandy. It was an invasion of land, sea, and air, and it is to liberate France because the Germans had occupied the entire country and put in a puppet government, and the actual real French government had to flee. At the same time, Russia is marching through, kind of trying to push into Poland in order to invade Berlin. So it's kind of like a two-sided invasion where they are really trying to take out the Germans and they did suffer a lot of losses with that invasion. As far as the previous year, the Battle of Stalingrad on the Eastern Front between the Germans and the Russians was an absolutely horrific battle that lasted through the winter. And as everybody knows, you do not invade Russia during the winter, and it did lead to millions of deaths. We will need to know the difference between fighting styles of World War I and World War II. If you look on the left, we've got, that's World War I, of course, with the trenches. On the right, we have more sophisticated tanks and technologies. And so we'll talk about the different fighting styles. It is very different from World War I. No trenches, more sophisticated technology. There are a lot of fast-moving fronts. This is different to the war that was fought in inches, World War I. A new technique that was used by the Germans is called the Blitzkrieg. This is also known as a lightning war, and this is kind of a method that they would use, especially in highly populated areas. They would do this. Remember, we're still talking about total wars, kind of a leftover from World War I. When everybody is used to mobilize against your enemy, especially citizens and things like that, you're talking about everybody being sort of free game. What they would do is use a lot of air vehicles, airplanes, things like that, to drop a lot of bombs onto the front. Then you would send in your foot soldiers and your tanks and really roll it in and take it all. Something we'll talk about with the Pacific Theater in a minute here is something called island hopping. It's really difficult to use airplanes when things are so far apart. So we really have aircraft carriers being utilized for, one of the first times. So tanks, airplanes, foot soldiers, after you have bombarded people by air and lots of different really deadly weapons at first. And of course, we're talking about the Pacific Theater, which was fought, a lot of it, through ships and airplanes. Not as much land action as the European theater. So this really begins with Japan's attack on China. Like I said, 1937 might actually be the original date for World War II because of Japan's activity. And that, of course, will end in 1945. So their assault on China is going to lead to about 20 million deaths. This is an extremely deadly war, guys. It's probably more, it's definitely more deadly for a citizen than the First World War was. Just your average day person. Beginning in 1941, Japan is attacking a lot of Southeast Asia and the Pacific Islands. They are going around growing their empire, trying to find resources. A turning point in the Pacific is the Battle of Midway, 1943. The U.S. firebombings of Japanese cities begin in 1945. They are trying to desperately trying to end the war as soon as they can to get the Japanese to surrender. That doesn't work. And by August of 1945, the United States makes the decision to use atomic weapons on two cities in Japan, Hiroshima, Nagasaki, and that will end in an unconditional surrender on the Japanese part. Here's a map of the Pacific Theater. We do see that the Japanese are growing their empire and their influence throughout the beginning of the war. Here is that Battle of Midway right here. And lots of different island hopping that was done because you're having to deal with, obviously, the geography of the Pacific being lots of islands. And what is your strategy going to be for that when you can't conduct a massive land invasion? And they also have on this map the 2 atomic bombs that were dropped on Japan. I encourage you to watch a lot of the videos that I've embedded in this lecture, so please go ahead and do that. There's World War II. All right, let's talk about the consequences of World War II. Please go ahead and watch this amazing visual of what were the casualties like as far as the numbers go for everybody involved in World War II. How did that go? One consequence of World War II would be the creation of the United Nations. They are kind of replacing the League of Nations. Remember, we talked about that as a consequence of World War I. There are a few differences, though. Number one, the United States is actually going to sign up and be involved in the United Nations. They did not join the League of Nations. And they are also hosting it. They're headquartering it in the United States and not in war-ravaged Europe. This is a huge deal for the United States. We're talking about them shifting into like being a central world power outside of Europe. One crucial creation for the United Nations is the Security Council that they create. We're talking about they actually have the ability to enforce a lot of beliefs that they are coming up with as a organization. They are also going to be involved in a lot of different upcoming conflicts that we're going to be discussing, including the Korean War, Persian Wars, a lot of, proxy wars as we go into the Cold War. Another obviously huge controversy is the use of atomic weapons. A lot of people make the argument that the United States had no choice. They would use it on Japan because they knew the astronomical amount of casualties that would be incurred on both sides should the United States actually invade Japan. And so now we're heading into kind of this time period where everybody's going to go into an arms race. As soon as this happens, the USSR starts working right away, and they gain atomic weapons. So right down here, we've got kind of the Russia is now testing the atomic bomb, and now we're officially in an atomic arms race. And this is kind of what it can do. There are a lot of pictures out there because the United States also used these bombings as sort of research for what these weapons could do in Japan. This is actually a shadow from a person that was sitting on these steps as the bomb went off. Go ahead and watch these two BBC videos about how the bombings took place. Why did they use them? And of course, how it, like a simulation of how it happened. So another consequence for World War II is that the United States is now at the forefront of world power. And, it's because Europe is kind of on the way out. They have experienced 2 world wars, whereas the United States didn't. The only part of the United States that was really touched by the war would be, Hawaii. It wasn't fought on a United States soil. The United States is also going to be crucial into helping the crippled economy of Europe with the Marshall Plan, and we'll get to that in a minute. The UN is also going to help out a lot of colonies later, especially in Asia and Africa, as we start to enter a time period of independence. And that is definitely something that will be discussed in chapter 37 with decolonization. Another horrific consequence of World War II is the Holocaust itself. Now, there are many genocides in the 20th century, but this is usually one that I choose to focus on because a lot of times it's because of the ideology and the fact that, it goes along with the rise of fascism that we tend to discuss in class. And it is just the example of how fascism can treat those who don't fit that national identity that they've decided is kind of the criteria for being part of your country at this time. The Holocaust really gains a lot of momentum in what is called Hitler's final solution. He's trying to solve a lot of problems for Germany. And remember, they were talking about Jews being a huge kind of population to blame for their problems. During his final solution, which is basically the bulk of the genocide that happened, he's targeting Jews and undesirables. So there's about 6 million Jews that were murdered and 4 million others. When I say others, I mean this could be people who are of other ethnic minorities like the Roma Gypsies. This could be people who were homosexual or those who had mental disabilities or physical disabilities. They are going after those kinds of people because they're not seen as like the perfect German. After the war, the UN is supporting kind of a place for Jews in the world because they realize that they've gone through so much discrimination, and the Holocaust is really kind of a catalyst for them establishing the Jewish homeland in Palestine, creating that nation of Israel. And this is where it starts. This is kind of a controversial topic for, well, the Middle East today. I encourage you to go ahead and watch this video. You can start at 18 minutes in because we talked about the first 18 minutes with the rise of fascism. And you should know those steps that were taken on the Holocaust, and they really were baby steps to begin with that are leading to up to 10 million people dead in a mass European genocide. So here's what happens when Israel is created in 1947. You can see that Palestine, there starting on the left, is quite a large territory. And as they go, we've got the original UN plan for the territory that Israel is going to share with Palestine. But as we go into modern day, Israel is expanding. And this is why it's such a controversial topic today, because they're not sharing the space in peace. And that's for a variety of reasons. But also Israel is starting to, well, dissolve Palestine, if we see there in 2012. Let's do the beginnings of the Cold War. Now, this is, of course, basically a direct cause of World War II. Shifts in power, who's kind of in charge now as far as global power, and the development of horrific weapons that definitely will frighten and create a lot of tensions between countries. After the United States drops the bomb on Japan, this kind of immediately there are tensions between the United States and the USSR. One of the first consequences that comes of that is the division of Germany and Berlin itself. So we've got Germany, after the war, is divided into 4 sectors. You'll see there that the United States occupies one, France occupies one, the UK, and the USSR. Now, eventually, the USSR is not going to play very fairly, and you'll see there's kind of like a white hole there in the USSR's chunk of Germany, and that's because they have Berlin within their sector. And so they will start cutting off those other 3 former allies there from accessing Berlin, and that leads to the Berlin airlift. And those other 3 countries feel the need to resupply Berlin and try to keep that going when it's being occupied by the Soviets. 1949 is like the official kind of breakup of the USSR and the Allies. Like they create the North Atlantic Treaty Organization in 1949, and that we call it NATO. And NATO will adopt the entirety of West Germany. So all those 3 sectors that aren't occupied by the USSR are going to be created into a new country called West Germany. The USSR sees a lot of, their former allies kind of banding together, and they will create the Warsaw Pact in order to try to balance their power. We're creating alliances again. It's never really ends well when we go ahead and do this. So here is how Germany is divided. You'll notice I've got kind of right here, we can see Berlin in the middle of East Germany now. Berlin was split up as well. So there were allied, France, Great Britain, and the United States were occupying half of Berlin. Berlin is now split in half. And that's why you may have heard of the Berlin Wall, which separated a city within a country occupied by the Soviets. Kind of an interesting situation for people living in West Berlin. So here, by 1960, Europe is divided. We've got NATO to the west, mostly, and the Warsaw Pact in the east. We're going to start talking about non-aligned nations. So all those other nations in like that kind of beigey color there, they are not choosing a side, which may end up working out well for them later as we get into even deeper and deeper into the Cold War of people just refusing to choose a side. The United States becoming a world superpower, we do have to know what their foreign policy is after World War II. So we've got President Truman in the office, 1947. The war is over. He is going to send economic and military aid to countries vulnerable to communism. Now, this is a big kind of slap in the face again, former allies of the USSR, and they are giving initial aid to Greece and Turkey because they do face a threat of turning to communism. This is kind of the beginning of the United States having this containment policy that we're going to stop communism in its tracks. It is a goal of communism to spread out over the world, and they want to control that. A little later on, the Marshall Plan is there, and this is where we're talking about the United States being a true superpower. They are having to now bail out Europe. They're sending billions of dollars to help their economy post-war. And we'll see there on the bottom right-hand corner, who are they sending the most amount of money to? Of course, they're first sending it to their World War II BFFs, UK and France. This is kind of where we're going to talk about the Cold War, kind of how it goes in the early 50s and 60s. We will discuss more of it during decolonization. We have later on, the USSR and China are now going to team up as we see Mao Zedong in power in China. This is going to lead to the Korean War as they are both trying to help out the Korean Peninsula in turning communism. The United States doesn't want that. Remember, we're talking about containing it in its tracks, and that's part of why they will try to go and help Korea, and we end up with Korea being kind of split in half. After Stalin's death in 1953, Khrushchev takes over, and he enters a time period in the USSR called de-Stalinization, where he is loosening the grip of that dictatorship on the USSR. And we'll talk a little bit more about those policies in chapter 38, globalization. Cuba. Now, this is a huge point of contention for the United States because Cuba, if you don't know, is quite close to the United States. It's just right there in the Caribbean, right under us. And so when Cuba falls to communism with Fidel Castro at its helm, the United States is worried. They now have a communist neighbor. And so in 1961, the CIA, the United States CIA, is going to launch a failed invasion of Cuba. It's pretty embarrassing, actually. It's called the Bay of Pigs. They're trying to infiltrate Cuba and get people within it to overthrow the government, and there is not a good idea. It doesn't work out. In 1962, kind of provoked by the United States involvement, the USSR is placing missiles in the Americas. Now, the United States has been continuing to grow its nuclear program throughout the 1950s, and they have started to place nuclear weapons around the world. So it only makes sense that the USSR is partaking in a similar tactic. But when they go and place them in Cuba, which is way too close for us, this is a really, really, it's like 2 weeks of tension. Are we going to fire missiles at each other or not? And eventually the USSR does agree to back down. In the 1960s, both the USSR and the USA are going to develop a policy called détente, and they're just going to try to not constantly point weapons at each other, try to ease the tension. And it's really difficult to do because we're not in the 60s, early 70s, we're talking about a Vietnam War taking place as well, which is heavily, heavily steeped in that containing communism motive. And we will discuss some of those proxy wars that take place in the battle between communism and democracy in chapter 37. More videos for you to watch there, guys. If you have any questions, please, please, please get in contact with me. I do plan on trying to be available at a set up time. I will let you know what that is to discuss World War II and the beginnings of the Cold War.